Elvis Presley stepped onto the stage uninvited, grabbed the second microphone, and started singing along like he owned the room, right in the middle of Dean Martin's biggest number. Wait, because what Dean did in the next 60 seconds wasn't what anyone expected from the King of Cool. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something that would make Elvis call him the only real gentleman in this town for the rest of his life. The Sands Hotel showroom was packed beyond capacity that February night in 1965. Every seat filled with the kind of crowd that only Las Vegas could assemble on a random Thursday evening. Movie stars and moguls occupied the best tables near the stage. Politicians sat with their mistresses in the shadowy corners. High rollers, who had flown in from Tokyo and Texas and everywhere in between, ordered bottles of champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The cigarette smoke hung in the air like expensive fog, creating halos around the crystal chandeliers, and the champagne had been flowing freely since the doors opened at 8. Dean was halfway through his second set, completely in command of every soul in the room, riding the kind of wave that performers dream about, but rarely experience. The kind where every joke lands perfectly, every note rings true, and the audience hangs on your every word like you're revealing the secrets of the universe. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Because this story is about to show you what happens when two kings collide on the same stage, and only one of them knows how to share a crown. Nobody saw Elvis come in. That was the first strange thing about the night. The king of rock and roll, the most famous face in America, the man whose photograph hung in teenage bedrooms from coast to coast, had somehow walked into the Sands Hotel without a single person noticing his arrival. No entourage trailing behind him like a royal procession, no bodyguards scanning the room for threats, no Memphis Mafia clearing a path through the crowd with their intimidating stares. Just Elvis, completely alone, wearing a dark suit instead of his usual flashy stage clothes, slipping through a side door like a ghost who had decided that invisibility was preferable to adulation. He had been drinking. That much became obvious later, when people reconstructed the events of the evening and tried to understand what had possessed him to do what he did. Not falling down drunk, not slurring his words or stumbling into tables, but enough to blur the edges of his normally sharp judgment, enough to silence the voice in his head that usually warned him about consequences. He had been in Las Vegas for 3 days by then, hiding from the world in a penthouse suite, avoiding the press that followed him everywhere, trying desperately to escape the crushing pressure that had become his constant companion. And somewhere in those 3 days of room service and whiskey and late-night television, watching old movies until the sun came up, he had decided that what he really needed was to see Dean Martin perform live. The problem was, seeing wasn't enough. Watching from the audience, anonymous in the darkness, where the stage lights couldn't reach, should have been enough for any normal person. But Elvis Presley had never been a normal person, and he had certainly never been good at staying in the background when music was playing. The spotlight called to him like a siren song from ancient mythology, irresistible and dangerous. And on this particular night, after this particular amount of whiskey, and this particular depth of loneliness, he found that he simply couldn't resist its pull any longer. Listen, what happened next would become one of the most legendary stories in Las Vegas entertainment history, told and retold in dressing rooms and casino bars for decades to come. Not because of the confrontation that everyone expected to witness, not because of the fight or the insults or the rivalry that should have erupted between two alpha performers sharing the same territory, but because of the extraordinary grace that nobody in that room could have predicted, the kind of grace that separates the truly great from the merely famous. Dean was in the middle of a ballad, one of his signature songs that the audience knew by heart and could have sung along with, if the moment hadn't been so perfect that interrupting it felt like sacrilege. The band was tight behind him, every musician locked into the groove after years of playing together. The lighting was perfect, a soft spotlight that made Dean glow like something not quite of this world. And Dean himself was doing what Dean did better than anyone else alive, making 2,000 people feel like he was singing directly to each of them individually, like they were the only person in the room who mattered, like this song had been written specifically for their ears and their hearts. It was the kind of performance that reminded everyone why he was called the King of Cool, the effortless master of the stage, who made the impossible look like it required no effort at all. And then Elvis appeared at the edge of the light. He walked up the side stairs, like he belonged there, like he had been personally invited by Dean himself, like this was the most natural thing in the world, and everyone should have been expecting it. His footsteps were steady, the whiskey hadn't affected his coordination, just his judgment, and his face wore an expression of pure childlike determination. The band faltered for a moment, their instruments wavering as confusion rippled through them, every musician looking to Dean for guidance on how to handle this unprecedented situation. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the room like a wave hitting a beach, 2,000 people simultaneously, realizing that something extraordinary was happening. And Dean kept singing, his voice never wavering, his eyes tracking Elvis's approach with an expression that nobody in that room could quite read or interpret. Elvis reached the spare microphone that stood at the edge of the stage, picked it up, and joined in on the second verse. Notice, the audacity of this moment cannot be overstated, even by someone who has spent their entire life in show business. Elvis Presley, uninvited, and clearly under the influence of alcohol, had just crashed Dean Martin's show in front of 2,000 paying customers and started singing along like they had rehearsed this collaboration for weeks. It was the kind of move that could destroy a friendship before it even began, end a career in a single evening, or start a feud that would dominate the tabloids and gossip columns for years to come. Every single person in that room held their breath, frozen in their seats, waiting with a mixture of dread and fascination to see how Dean would react to this unprecedented invasion of his professional territory. He had options, and everyone knew what those options were. He could have stopped the song mid-verse, called security with a snap of his fingers, and had Elvis escorted out of the building with maximum embarrassment and minimum dignity. He could have made a cutting joke at Elvis's expense, turned the moment into a punchline that would have gotten laughs from the audience, but left permanent scars on whatever relationship might have existed between them. He could have walked off stage himself, letting his pointed silence speak louder than any words could, leaving Elvis alone in the spotlight, with no accompaniment and no idea what to do next. Dean did none of those things. Instead, he did something that would define his character forever. Instead, he smiled. Not his stage smile, not the practiced charm he deployed nightly to sell tickets and records, and the illusion that everything in life was effortless and fun. This was a real smile, warm and genuine, and utterly spontaneous, like an old friend had just walked through the door unexpectedly, and Dean couldn't have been more delighted to see them. He shifted his position slightly, making room for Elvis beside him at center stage, and adjusted his own microphone stand so their voices could blend together properly. It was the gesture of a host welcoming a guest, not a king defending his territory. And then something magical happened, something that nobody in that room would ever be able to adequately describe to people who weren't there to witness it. They sang together. Dean and Elvis, the King of Cool and the King of Rock and Roll, sharing a stage that was only supposed to hold one of them at a time. Their voices wove together in a way that nobody could have planned or rehearsed. Dean's smooth baritone, providing a foundation that Elvis's raw emotional power could soar above, creating harmonies that had never existed before and would never exist again after this night ended. The band, recovering from their initial shock with the professionalism of seasoned Vegas musicians, found the groove and locked in behind the two legends with a tightness that suggested they had been playing together for years. The audience, slowly realizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of entertainment, began to cheer with an enthusiasm that bordered on hysteria. Stop for a second and picture this scene from above, because the image of it matters more than any words could ever capture. Two of the most famous performers in the entire world, icons whose faces were recognized on every continent, standing side by side on a Las Vegas stage, singing a love song together, while 2,000 people watched in amazement with tears streaming down their faces. No competition between them, no ego demanding dominance, no territorial defensiveness about whose spotlight this was supposed to be. Just two artists sharing a moment of pure musical connection that transcended their public personas and their carefully managed images, a moment that would never be repeated no matter how many times people tried to recreate it. The song ended with a final sustained note that seemed to hang in the air forever. The applause that followed was thunderous, the kind of ovation that shakes the chandeliers and leaves your ears ringing for hours afterward, the kind that makes your chest vibrate with the sheer force of 2,000 people expressing joy simultaneously. Elvis stood there in the spotlight, the whiskey haze starting to clear from his eyes as the adrenaline of performance burned through it, and suddenly, with terrible clarity, he realized exactly what he had done. He had just crashed Dean Martin's show. He had interrupted the King of Cool, uninvited and intoxicated, in front of 2,000 paying customers. He had made a complete and utter fool of himself. And now that the song was over and the magic was fading, he was going to have to face the consequences of his impulsive decision. But Dean wasn't finished with him yet. Not by a long shot. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said, his voice cutting through the applause with that effortless authority that only decades of performing can create. "I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. Some of you might recognize him. He's been known to sing a song or two." The audience laughed, the tension breaking like a fever. Elvis stood there, frozen, not sure whether he was being mocked or embraced. Dean turned to him, still holding the microphone, still smiling that genuine smile. "What do you say, kid? You came all the way up here. You might as well stay for another song." Wait. The offer was extraordinary by any measure, the kind of gesture that most performers would never even consider making, let alone execute with such effortless grace. Dean Martin, in front of his own audience, at his own show on his own stage, was inviting Elvis Presley to stay and continue performing, not as a favor that would need to be repaid, not as a rescue mission designed to save Elvis from embarrassment, but as a genuine and heartfelt invitation to share the spotlight that Dean had earned through decades of hard work. It was the kind of generosity that separates the truly great performers from the merely successful ones, the kind that builds legends and creates stories that people tell for generations. Elvis's face went through a transformation that the people in the front rows would never forget, no matter how many years passed. First came shock, pure and unfiltered, as he processed what Dean had just offered. Then came relief, washing over his features like a wave, as he realized that he wasn't going to be humiliated in front of 2,000 strangers. And finally came something that looked almost like tears, glistening in his eyes under the stage lights, as the full weight of Dean's kindness settled into his heart. He nodded, not trusting his voice to speak without breaking, and Dean turned back to the band with the casual confidence of a man who had just made someone's entire year. "Let's do something we both know," Dean said. "Something that'll let our friend here show these nice people what he can really do when he's not crashing parties." Remember, what happened over the next 45 minutes would become the stuff of legend, the kind of story that gets passed down through generations of performers, like a sacred text. Dean and Elvis, trading songs back and forth like old friends at a piano bar, duetting on classics that showcased both their voices, improvising harmonies that had never been sung before and would never be sung again after this singular night ended. Between numbers, they told jokes to the audience, gently ribbing each other with the warmth and affection of brothers, rather than the sharp competitiveness of rivals fighting for the same territory. The audience, realizing with growing wonder that they were witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime event that would never be repeated, sat in rapt attention throughout, afraid to even leave for the bathroom, in case they missed something that would become part of entertainment history. At one point, during a brief pause, while the band reorganized for the next song, Elvis leaned over to Dean and said something in a low voice that the microphones didn't pick up. Dean laughed in response, a real laugh, spontaneous and delighted, not the practiced chuckle of a performer working an audience. Whatever Elvis had said, it was clearly an apology for his behavior, and Dean's easy laughter was clearly an acceptance that required no further discussion. "You know what your problem is?" Dean said, loud enough this time for the entire audience to hear, his voice carrying that particular warmth that made everyone feel like they were in on a private joke. "You've got too much talent and not enough sense. Lucky for you, I've got enough sense for both of us." The audience roared with laughter and applause, delighted by the exchange. Elvis ducked his head in acknowledgement, accepting the gentle rebuke with a grace and humility that surprised everyone who thought they knew him from his public image. This wasn't the swaggering king of rock and roll, the hip-shaking rebel who had scandalized parents and thrilled teenagers across America. This was something else entirely, a young man who had made a serious mistake and been forgiven for it by someone he clearly admired more than he could express in words. Listen. The show eventually had to end, as all shows must. Dean had other commitments waiting for him, other obligations that couldn't be postponed, just because something magical and unprecedented was happening on his stage. But before the final number of the evening, before the house lights came up, and reality reasserted itself, he did something that would cement his reputation as the classiest act in all of show business, something that people would talk about for decades whenever the subject of true professionalism came up. He gave Elvis the stage, completely, without reservation or condition. "I've been up here long enough tonight," Dean said, carefully setting down his microphone on its stand with a deliberate finality. "These wonderful people came to see a show, and I think they've gotten considerably more than they paid for. But before I go backstage and pour myself something cold, I want to give my friend here a chance to do what he does best, what he does better than anyone else in the world." He turned to Elvis, extending his hand in a gesture that was part invitation, part blessing, part coronation. "It's all yours now, kid. Show them what you've really got when you're not crashing other people's parties." Elvis took the stage alone, standing in the spotlight that Dean had just vacated, looking out at 2,000 faces that were waiting to see what he would do with this unexpected gift. And for the next 15 glorious minutes, he gave the performance of his entire life. Not the flashy, hip-shaking spectacle that had made him famous and scandalized parents across America. Something rawer than that, more vulnerable, more emotionally honest than anything he had ever done in front of an audience. He sang ballads that showcased the pure beauty of his voice rather than his famous moves, songs that required nothing but a microphone and a soul laid bare. He talked to the audience between numbers, sharing stories and jokes with a warmth and intimacy that many of them had never seen from the guarded, carefully managed king of rock and roll. He was, for those 15 extraordinary minutes, not the icon or the legend or the product. He was just a kid from Memphis who loved to sing more than anything else in the world, and had been given an unexpected gift by a man he would never ever forget. When it was finally over, when the final note had faded into silence, and the applause had eventually died down like waves retreating from a beach, Elvis sought out Dean backstage in the cramped corridor behind the curtain. The adrenaline of performance had worn off completely, the whiskey had faded from his system, and the full weight of what he had done that night was starting to sink into his bones like cold water. "Mr. Martin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, hoarse from singing and raw from emotion, "I don't know how to thank you properly. What I did out there tonight, coming up on your stage uninvited like that, interrupting your show in front of all those people, it was wrong. It was disrespectful. You had every right in the world to have me thrown out on my ear. Hold this moment in your mind, because what Dean said next would define his character more clearly than anything else he ever did on stage or off, more clearly than any interview or biography or carefully managed public statement could ever hope to capture. Kid, let me tell you something important about this business we're in. We're all just trying to make people happy. That's the job. When you strip away all the glamour and the money and the fame, that's what we do. We make strangers forget their troubles for a few hours. And tonight those people out there in the audience, they're going home happy. They saw something they'll never forget as long as they live. They got their money's worth, and then some. Dean put his hand on Elvis's shoulder, meeting his eyes with an intensity that cut through all the showbiz facade and performer's armor. You didn't ruin my show tonight. You made it better. You made it something special. And if you ever doubt that, if you ever wake up at 3 a.m. feeling ashamed about what happened here, you come find me, and I'll remind you of what really happened. Elvis was quiet for a long moment, processing the words, letting them sink into a heart that had grown accustomed to criticism and manipulation and people wanting things from him. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that he made no attempt to hide. They told me you were different. The other performers, the people who've been in this business for decades, they all said Dean Martin was the real thing, that you weren't like the rest of us, all ego and competition and jealousy. I didn't believe them at first. I thought it was just talk, just another Hollywood myth. He paused, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. I believe them now, every word. Notice, the friendship that began that night would last for the rest of their lives, though it was never the kind of friendship that got photographed at parties or written about in celebrity magazines. It was something quieter than that, more private, more genuine, and therefore more precious. Phone calls on birthdays and holidays when schedules aligned. Backstage visits when they happened to be performing in the same city. A mutual respect that deepened over the years into something that neither of them ever tried to define with words, but both of them treasured more than the public could ever know. If you want to know what happened years later, when Elvis's life started to spiral downward, and Dean was one of the few people who tried desperately to reach him through the fog of pills and isolation, tell me in the comments. Some stories don't have endings, just long pauses that stretch into eternity. Some friendships survive everything except the final silence that claims us all. The Sands Hotel was demolished in 1996, replaced by a newer, bigger casino that nobody remembers the name of anymore. The 2,000 people who witnessed that legendary night have scattered across the world over the decades, carrying their own versions of the story with them wherever they went. Some of them embellished the details over the years, adding flourishes that couldn't possibly have happened, but made for better telling. Others downplayed what they had seen, unable to fully believe the evidence of their own eyes and ears. But the core of it, Dean Martin's grace under pressure, his refusal to humiliate a rival who had given him every reason to do so, his instinctive decision to share rather than compete, that part has never changed in any telling. Elvis died in August of 1977, and Dean Martin was one of the pallbearers who carried his casket to its final resting place. He didn't give any interviews about the loss, didn't write about it in his autobiography, didn't try to capitalize on their connection in any way that would have been so easy and so profitable. When journalists asked about Elvis in later years, hoping for some exclusive revelation or scandalous detail, Dean would just shake his head slowly and say he was a good kid who got lost somewhere along the way. Fame does that to people sometimes. We all get lost, if we live long enough. Dean himself passed away in 1995, on Christmas Day of all days, as if even death itself had to acknowledge his impeccable sense of timing. Among his personal effects, carefully preserved in a box his family had never opened, they found a photograph that none of them had ever seen before. Dean and Elvis, backstage at the Sands Hotel, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera like two kids who had just gotten away with something wonderful and couldn't believe their luck. On the back of the photograph, in Elvis's distinctive handwriting, were 5 simple words that said everything that needed to be said. The only real gentleman. That photograph has never been published or shared with the public. It remains with Dean's family to this day. A private reminder of a public moment. A testament to what can happen when 2 kings decide together that the kingdom is big enough for both of them to rule. That's the story of Dean Martin, and the night Elvis Presley crashed his show without warning or invitation. That's what happens when grace meets raw talent, when generosity defeats ego, when the right response to an unexpected intrusion is not anger or embarrassment, but an open-armed invitation to share the spotlight. One stage that became a shared kingdom for one night. One song that became many songs. One decision to share instead of compete that changed 2 lives forever. Remember the Sands Hotel and what happened on its legendary stage. Remember the night 2 kings sang together when they could have fought. Remember what Dean Martin taught us all about being a true gentleman in a world that doesn't always reward gentleness or grace or generosity. And ask yourself this question, honestly and sincerely. If someone crashed your moment, interrupted your spotlight without permission, threatened to steal your hard-earned thunder, would you have the grace to make room for them beside you, instead of pushing them away? Some questions reveal who we truly are at our very core. Some nights create lasting legends that outlast the people who lived them by decades and generations. This was one of those nights.